First of all, I wanted to say that I paid my library fees before coming here. Just wanted to be on good terms before, so you'd well receive me. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm not supposed to talk about libraries. I'm supposed to talk about the work that I do, which is what I will do. But I will say libraries, you probably hear stories like this all the time. We're essential and pivotal to the way in which I was raised. My parents, who I have a picture of right there, are from India, and when they moved here, I'm in Minnesota, I grew up in St. Paul, our public library, the Arden Hills Public Library, was amazing. I mean, the librarian would call my mom and tell her that the new Encyclopedia Brown books were out, so I should come in and get them. They helped her sort of as she was learning English. I mean, it was just, and they continue to be an important part of my life. So when I was invited to speak here, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about libraries, but I took some time to reflect and think about them. And then I came across the Angry Librarian on Twitter. Oh my, yes. And in a recent wonderfulness, he talks about public libraries have become what they have become in the 21st century is a model for building community and enhancing opportunities for underserved and marginalized people. Those dusty books still exist, but today they're side by side with technology, maker spaces, interactive learning environments, and librarians that are trained to teach their communities how to use them. Today, depending on the community they serve, a public librarian is part educator, part social worker, and part human Google. What they aren't is a living anachronism, an out-of-touch holdout in a dying job who's consigned to a desk scolding kids for returning books a few days late. I love that. So that's the aspiration for which I'm speaking of out of today. So these are my parents. I grew up in an immigrant enclave, suburban, middle class sort of upbringing. Issues of race, place, and poverty were foreign to me. And then in college, I started living in community in sort of a central city neighborhood in Minneapolis. It was about 6 blocks from where my parents first landed when they immigrated here from India. In their pursuit of the American dream, right, they moved to a suburban middle-class neighborhood, became homeowners. They were shocked and kind of angry at what seemed like downward mobility to them. But this is where life and the world came alive for me. I started to build relationships and understand what injustice looks like, the ways in which institutional and structural racism plays out in every aspect of life, and since then have transitioned from being a civil engineer to doing this work of urban planning, community development, and really figuring out how do we make a more fair and just world for everybody. So, click forward. I work at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. I get to lead a team of multidisciplinary folks, urban planners, researchers, public policy folks, and we start from the premise that neighborhood residents are the most powerful asset we have for community change, and then we get to target all of these resources to the community-based organizations that serve them, the residents themselves, and government, city, county, others in the work of advancing more racial justice in the Twin Cities and the state of Minnesota as a whole. Some of the sort of core aspects of how we think about our work is everything we do is about race. Race is what formed the neighborhoods that we work in, and it has to be a part of how we move forward. Everything we do involves the people themselves. We have to do that work together. It is not a top-down technocratic or bureaucratic process that's going to get us to where we need to go. And that we need to advocate for more government action, which I know is hard. I loved the organizing effort here in the morning, or just before I came on. But we used government resources tilted in the favor of white folks in the early 20th century. Today, yesterday, we have to continue to do that work targeted to people of color, immigrants, indigenous folks today. So who deserves to live in a community rich with opportunity? Everybody. This is my art for the day. So I want to talk, so I'll just say this quick. My talk is wide-ranging. It is, I swear it's going to land. Has anybody read the book Wonderstruck? It's now a movie. Brian Selznick, like, he has these 2 stories, and you're like, what is happening? Or Pam Munoz-Ryan has a great book called Echo, right? It just goes like this, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, this is all connected. That's my hope. Our country has a lot of stories about poverty, and depending on how you grew up, your religious experience, your cultural experience, your educational experience, those stories shape what you know. Generally in America, though, this narrative around poverty is that you are at fault for your own poverty. It's still grounded in sort of this individualistic, meritocratic paradigm, which I'll talk about more later. And tons of research that shows we just constantly focus on personal choices and individual responsibility rather than the larger institutional and structural forces. So myths around, anybody can make it if you play by the rules, opportunity exists for everybody, and that with enough individual effort, anybody can make it in this land of opportunity. I call this the golden triangles of American mythology: meritocracy, personal responsibility and individualism, and equal opportunity. I think you'll have access to all these slides. I go fast. I have 100 slides, so my students always tell me to slow down. I don't, but I might listen to you guys. Forward. So obviously the world is not perfect, and so these values don't actually play themselves out. I think one of the things this leads to, though, being grounded in these narratives, is that we tend to then focus on who versus why, or the way I describe it is sort of players versus games. So if life, and I don't like game metaphors for life, but if life was a game, like Monopoly, right? In Monopoly, the reality is that everybody starts out with the same amount of money and nobody owns any properties. That is not the real world, right? In the real world, some people have lots of properties: Park Place, Boardwalk, all the properties, and more money. And then we ask people to play the game, and then we focus on the playing, right? The individual. How good are you at playing the game? We don't think about changing the game itself. So what that ends up looking like is we stay on sort of the A and B paths, where we look at people's individual capacity, their human capital, their skills, social class and background, and less time on some of the institutional and structural failings. It's not obviously all of that, right? So we have a community development movement that started in the 60s and 70s that was focused on some of these structural realities, right? Looking at racism, redlining, and the disinvestment that had happened and the overinvestment in white communities through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And even with that movement, so many of the disparities continue to exist today, right? So I can give you statistic after statistic after statistic about how severe and persistent racial inequality is in our country. I'm not going to do that. Grounding point: race, place, and well-being continue to be highly correlated in our country. I'm going to use the Twin Cities because that's what I know best to describe some of this, and I'm guessing it's true of a lot of the places where you all are from as well. So this is a map we made that just shows how concentrated white wealth is spatialized in the Twin Cities region. So the dark purple that's sort of surrounding the white bubble in the middle is sort of where we see the largest pockets of white wealth, which makes sense, right, with the way in how we understand suburbanization. If we look then at the central city, you can see these blue chunks as the places in which racially concentrated areas of poverty exist. So the disparities we see, again, are both social and spatial. And so we have to always be thinking about the way in which, again, race, place, and well-being remain correlated. I'm going to stick with the Twin Cities for just a minute, too, because, again, I think this is symbolic of other cities and regions across the country. Is in the Twin Cities, we have a narrative that we're awesome. We have so many top 10 lists, bikes and parks and different things. But the reality is those social and economic assets do not benefit everybody. They do not translate to everybody, especially low-wealth communities, communities of color. So we actually lead the country. I don't know if you knew this, in racial disparities in so many categories: housing, home ownership, unemployment, and rates of poverty. And yet those stories get lost in what we think we believe about the place. The other reality for us, which is true across the country, is we're diversifying. So 100% of the growth in the Twin Cities in the next 25 years is going to be from people of color. For the state of Minnesota, 75% of all growth. That's happening faster in other states, and we have cities across the country that are already majority people of color as well. So the people who are doing the least well are the people who are going to be the future of our cities and regions. The other thing that we have to realize, and this sort of comes to some of the placemaking work, is that land that was once deemed not valuable in central city neighborhoods is now being deemed valuable again, right? We're having a return to the city. I'm going to walk around Philadelphia after this to explore gentrifying neighborhoods. I was just in Detroit. Who's here from Detroit? Anybody?
Well, I was born there.
Oh, I had the weirdest experience. I got 100 slides, so I got to keep going. But I have the weirdest experience in Detroit. It felt like I was in a dystopian nightmare. Like, this downtown felt like a privatized place with private security and private cameras. And there's things we celebrate about Detroit's revitalization, but I'm not sure how. Anyway, I'm going to leave that. So these are some of the trends, right? So places where communities of color have lived, the land value is increasing. And so what's going to happen? In Minneapolis, as well as across the country, housing affordability is declining. We're doing research to look at the number of census tracts that are affordable over time to different communities of color. And essentially, we're writing a report that's called The Shrinking City. And I think we could probably replicate that for every city in the country, again, because of the dynamics we're seeing in metropolitan growth. So broad trends across the country. We're becoming increasingly diverse. Disparities are more visible. We talk about it a lot more in our region. I don't know how it is in the cities and counties that you work in. Income inequality is clearly on the rise. The wealth gap continues. The racial wealth gap is through the roof. The combination then of stagnant wages and rising values of homes and rents is leading to increasing displacement pressures. We're always asking the question, we have a big municipal election in Minneapolis and St. Paul on Tuesday, who gets to live in our city in 2025? And then demographic inversion, that sort of return to the city dynamic as white folks are coming back from the suburbs, millennials are choosing to live in the city. You know, some folks we work with see the suburbs as like a blip in American history, a 50-year failed experiment. I ask my students all the time, how many of you want to live in the suburbs? None of them. And so as folks are getting pushed out from the central city to the suburbs, that's where we're seeing a lot of the poverty. So then I meet folks too who sometimes say to me, Neeraj, oh my gosh, we're 150 years past slavery, we're 50 years past civil rights, we had Barack Obama, you got Jay-Z, Obama, Beyonce, Oprah. I mean, come on. If you can't make it in this country now, it is your own dang fault. And I'm going to continue to argue that that's just not the case, that the basic structures of our society remain unjust, that what we live with today is the result of careful planning, and thus it will take careful planning to get us out of here. The public policies of yesterday, the racist public policies of yesterday, shape our racial landscape today, and we have to talk about this. We have to visualize it, we have to see it. I was listening to Brian Stevenson. Does anybody know who Brian Stevenson is, right? He runs the Equal Justice Initiative in the South, and he is creating a lynching museum, and he was on The Daily Show telling Trevor Noah, you know, if you go to South Africa, they remind you about apartheid. If you go to Germany, they remind you about the Holocaust. When you come to the United States, it's like, what? We're perfect, it's good, it's equal, we're fine, right? And anything you try to do to sort of contest that is like, you're not American. And so we have to begin to acknowledge where we are. So where we are is one thing, and as we think about where we want to go, right, I am going to get to principles of equitable development at the end, but you can't get there, in my mind, if we don't develop some sense of shared analysis of how we got here and why we remain here. So how did we get here? These geographies of inequality. This is a slide you're not meant to see, but on my wall and in my teaching, I have a 10-foot timeline of all of the forces that I think, and then I'm always constantly asking people to help me add to it. Migration forces, public policies, economic forces, all sorts of things that shape where we are today. I made a small list right here, which again would be, you know, 14 weeks of my class if you want to register next fall. But some of the principles of manifest destiny, cultural imperialism, and violence, of which our country was founded on, remain underneath all of the decisions we continue to make when we think about urban planning and community development. So if what we're doing, or this is the work I'm doing, and I think this is the work that a lot of libraries are thinking about doing, is fighting for equitable geographies, then what are we fighting for? What are we fighting against? The invasion of hipsters in our neighborhoods, rent increases and evictions, state and city policies, the lack of federal funds for housing, income inequality. I just made a short list, all of it, right? It is. It's all of these things. It is a tremendous amount of work. that we need to be doing to address how we got here and why we remain here. Now, the problem is that as we do this work, I would argue we fall back on an oversimplified, under-theorized analysis of issues of race, place, and poverty. We spend in the urban planning, community development, even civil rights field, especially civil rights like law, focusing too much on what to do with too many poor people of color living in one place rather than poverty itself. And so we've defined so much of the problem as a concentration of poverty. And so if your definition of the problem is concentration, what is your solution? Deconcentration. I gave that. So you can deconcentrate in two ways, which then I heard these ideas, right? Dilute or disperse. And you know, these are broad brushstrokes I'm making, but essentially, if you look at my timeline when you come visit me in Minneapolis, you'll see that we have so much public policy that's either focused on dispersal, which is how do I help you move to a neighborhood that's in the suburbs, that's more white, that's less poor, where the streets are already safe and the schools are already good, which is not a bad thing. But again, the question of does that address people's poverty? There's mixed results. And then dilution, which is the attraction into the place where you are right now. When we talk about dispersal, I often connect that to the work of integration. When we connect that to dilution, I connect it to the work of gentrification. Again, neither do anything to address the underlying issues of structural and institutional racism and what allows poverty to exist in the first place. Both are premised on what we call at Cura the white proximity model, which is really the best I can do is get you closer to white folks, and we've invested in white communities and in white people, and the closer I get you to them, there's some sort of trickle-down effect in their schools and in their houses and in their businesses, et cetera. This is a very complicated idea that I have a single line on a chart with. But I think you get the gist of what it is, and it's an indictment, I think, of some of our work. So we got to go deeper to address these issues. So I often frame my work as in how do you solve a problem as old as the United States of America? I got 30 minutes left. Let's do this. So we focus too much on those. This is just like a simplified meme that I found on the internet. But those 51 years in green, and we're like, that's the problem we're trying to solve. And I'm going to argue we're solving a problem way bigger than that. We have an origin story in our country, right, that good and brave men settled this dangerous place and civilized it. We started with a gentrification and displacement narrative. That is it. That's in the DNA of our country, and we have not gotten rid of that. And we live in a society that is organized around the fundamental belief that white people are more valued than others. And we haven't gotten rid of that element, right? So I talked about apartheid in South Africa, Nazi Germany. These are places where you could see clearly how the society was organized. I'm going to skip some of that stuff. So Martin Luther King Jr. has this quote where he says, most whites in America proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement, that white America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. It's essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects to retain it. I call this static enhancement versus transformational justice. So much of our work is about taking the world as it is, making it a little bit better, right? It's working on the players, but not the game. Transformational justice is about really hitting much deeper, more upstream around root causes. We like to believe a beautiful lie in our country rather than the ugly truth, which is that race, white supremacy, and racial hierarchy is robbing everybody in our country of their humanity, right? Everybody. How many people would agree with this statement? How many people would agree with this statement? Yeah, right? So there's a lot of hate in the world today. I was taking pictures of signs in my neighborhood, right? There's so much hate in the world today that we need to, I don't know, is this happening in your cities? People are putting signs up everywhere like, you're welcome here. Yeah. Like I need to put up a sign for you to know you can come into the grocery store? Anyway, I just think it's crazy. James Baldwin has this quote, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense that once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. And I think there's something about that too. When I think about the way in which we do public policy and urban planning, I often think the first thing we do is ascribe value to somebody, and then from there we allocate resources, or love, or empathy, or compassion, right? So the greater value I give you, the more resources I give you. The less value I give you, the less resources I give you. And so in our society, we have a whole group of people that we consider nobodies. So Mark Lamont Hill has this book called Nobody, which you should read. It's brilliant. And he says, without a doubt, nobodiness is largely indebted by race, as white supremacy is foundation to the American democratic experiment, the belief that white people are worth more than others, what Princeton University theologian Eddie Glaude Jr. calls the value gap, continues to color every aspect of our public and private lives. These conditions and actions reflect a prevailing belief that the vulnerable are unworthy of investment, protection, or even the most fundamental provisions of the social contract. As a result, they can be erased and abandoned and left to die. Anybody know who Darren Wilson is? Anybody from St. Louis? Darren Wilson was the police officer that shot Michael Brown in Ferguson. In his book, Nobody, Mark Lamont Hill goes through some of the transcript of his testimony. And he has this piece in here. As he, Michael Brown, is coming towards me, I keep telling him to get on the ground. He doesn't. I shoot a series of shots. I don't know how many I shot. I just know I shot it. Right? Your ability to dehumanize, to call a man a human being, it renders that person disposable. And I would argue at the root of so many of our persistent inequality and racial inequality is this dehumanization. And that somehow we got to do something about the way in which humans become its. John Powell, who's a scholar at UC Berkeley, talks about the process of othering, which is essentially the academic way for him to say, like, we have an us versus them society, an in versus out, and that every conflict we have is essentially about this dynamic of who's in and who's out, who's worthy and who's not, who's deserving and who's not. And of course, it's not new. It exists in the entire history of our country. And there's many mechanics of how this work in urban planning, community development, probably in libraries, domination, abandonment, marginalization, exploitation. I'm going to jump a little bit. So Iris Marion Young, who's a feminist scholar, has this circle of human concern, and I just sort of put Darren Wilson and Michael Brown in this. She talks about these 5 faces of oppression, and 2 that I'm just going to highlight. One is exploitation. Exploitation is where you are on the inside of the circle, but just on the edge. This is where you don't have that much human value, but you have an economic value to me. This is where slavery happens. This is where low-wage work happens. If you get put out the circle, this is what she called marginalization. This is where you do not have human value at all. This is where you die. This is where you're murdered. This is where genocide happens. And I think of these forms of exploitation and marginalization in the communities that I work in as 2 of the big ways where we do othering and kind of exclusion, and then we don't care about how folks are doing, and we don't then invest the resources, attention, and opportunity. And so my first big point, if that's the first one, is that we have to expand the circle of human concern. We have to figure out how to erase false boundaries. This is from John Powell again, of who's in and who's out. Expand the circle of human concern. Water. Number 2, equity is not a zero-sum game. So we have a quote in Minnesota from our late, great Senator Paul Wellstone: "We all do better when we all do better." I don't actually think Minnesotans believe that. I think they believe we all do better as long as I do better, or we all do better as long as my kids are still doing better than your kids, or white people do better when white people do better. But that's framed, I think, in this zero-sum game, a lens of scarcity. And the truth is, and research shows, that we actually all do better when people of color, indigenous people, immigrant communities do better. And we have to frame how we understand that differently and get out of the lens of scarcity, right? You can't wake up in the morning, right? Brene Brown, everybody read Brene Brown? Never enough time, never enough money, never enough sleep, never enough resources. That scarcity lens is related to that first triangle I told you about, right? So if this is the golden triangles now, equal opportunity, meritocracy, individualism. The other one that exists is these, I think: scarcity, commodification, and dehumanization. And scarcity, I think, locks us in our ability. And scarcity is hard. I mean, it's hard not to. Resources are tight. You know, we can't argue with that. But hey, we built a $1 billion stadium in Minneapolis. Not so tight. And when you live out of anxiety and scarceness, you don't have time for the public good. And the research shows that actually prosperity and inclusion go together. You can do good as a region, and you can do well as a region while you do good. In fact, the research says that as you reduce inequality, inequality is the #1 drag on economic growth in a region. So actually, if you reduce inequality in a place, everybody actually does better. In my region, we calculated $15 to $18 billion increase in the GDP if you put the racial disparities to 0, right? That means home ownership disparities gone, unemployment disparities gone, educational outcomes disparity gone. But again, that's hard. We operate often out of, I call this the rising tide does not lift all boats. It's sort of the liberal version of trickle-down theories, which is like, hey, I'm going to deal with something as a whole, and then everybody's going to benefit. So this is a quote from Barack Obama in 2010. He was asked by like a group of black journalists, like, what are you going to do about black unemployment in the United States? And he said, listen, I'm going to deal with unemployment as a whole, and black folks are going to benefit as well. The data doesn't show that that actually works out very well. Treating people who are situated differently is not fair. So treating people the same, I always tell my kids, yo, sameness and fairness, not the same thing. If your brother goes to a birthday party and gets a piece of cake, doesn't mean you get a piece of cake. That's maybe a bad example. But equity and equality are two totally different things. Equity is about an outcome, right? And so John Powell, again, talks about this idea of targeted universalism, that we have to take the time to understand how are people situated to the opportunity we're trying to create equality for, right? All children graduate from high school. And we have to understand that students are situated differently. If English is your second language, then you need different resources. If you have a party at your house and you invite me and I'm gluten and dairy free, are you gonna have pizza? I mean, you might for some, but you're gonna take the time to understand how I'm situated, right? If the meeting is on the second floor of the library, you gotta have an elevator. Unless you don't want people in wheelchairs to make it up, right? And so thinking about how we can articulate universal goals but use targeted strategies becomes essential to the work that we're doing as well. So we're expanding the circle of human concern, we're getting out of the scarcity mindset, and we're developing targeted strategies for our universal outcomes, which is, of course, hard, like really hard. And it's hard for all of the reasons I've kind of touched on here and there. Angela Glover Blackwell, who's a CEO of PolicyLink, a great national organization in the Bay Area, she wrote in the Stanford Social Innovation Review this article about the curb cut effect, where she looked at the American Disabilities. She talks about the American Disabilities Act as a targeted strategy, right, to make sure that people with disabilities had a fair and just access to everything in our society, and then speaks to how everybody benefits from the American Disabilities Act. Right? You ever had a stroller on a curb cut? You ever used an elevator? Who's used an elevator? All right. In Minnesota, it's icy. It's nice to have railings on the, stairs and different things. And so we have things we have done for people who I would argue are closer to the center of the circle of human concerns. People with disabilities occupy a different place in our imagination from a value perspective. They didn't always, but at the time in which this happened, then maybe people who are Muslim, or people who are immigrants, or people who are undocumented. But the curb cut effect, right, she writes this: access, opportunity, and the new demographics. There's an ingrained societal suspicion that intentionally supporting one group hurts another, that equity is a zero-sum game. In fact, when the nation targets support where it is needed most, when we create the circumstances that allow those who have been left behind to participate and contribute fully, everybody wins. The corollary is also true. When we ignore the challenges faced by the most vulnerable among us, those challenges, magnified many times over, become a drag on economic growth, prosperity, and national well-being. So curb cut thinking is a way for me to animate the difference between equity and equality. Equality gives everyone the right to ride the bus. Equity ensures that there are curb cuts so people in wheelchairs can get on it, that the bus go to where people need to go, etc. So I'm kind of hitting this point hard, but when we knock down the walls of exclusion, when we expand the circle of human concern, when we build pathways for success, everybody benefits. Those are the 3 principles. And then we have to be explicit. We have to be explicit, and we have to not be agnostic when it comes to questions of who benefits. So we have a history of making places for some people and not for others. Our cities and regions are changing dramatically. Areas that have been, historically purposefully disinvested are now places of investment. I was talking about land value changing. We are revitalizing riverfronts. We are building light rail. We are building stadiums for every sport you can ever imagine. This is my region. I don't know if it's true for you, but I think about light rail, stadium development, and riverfront development as like the nail in the coffin for low and moderate income people in my city and region. They just are targeted for folks who are not low income. And so we always have to be asking the question, who benefits? Who benefits? In the article I wrote about some of these things, it's sort of like, put it in your logic models, right? Be explicit. This is what we're trying to do with this program or this initiative, and this is how they're situated to that opportunity, and then measure your success every step of the way. So if somebody's coming into your area and doing some community development work, the first question I would ask them, who is this meant to benefit and how? Over and over again. When you're engaging your community, who benefits and how? So when we start to think about equitable development as a term or an idea, I see this as different than just revitalization, right? Equitable development has a specific end game, a specific set of beneficiaries that it is focused on ensuring benefit. So some definitions, right, is equitable development is helping low-income and overburdened communities participate and benefit from decisions that shape their neighborhood and region. It's not just about revitalizing disadvantaged neighborhoods, but also to ensure that low-income residents have access to and benefit from opportunities like jobs, housing, education, and transportation. It is fundamentally both place-based and people-focused. These are some principles of equitable development. And again, this is to ensure that as we go into the work, we're asking important questions. If you're going to do $1 million library renovation, who gets the contract? Who's earning the money to do that work? It matters. It's a way to have more impact than just the structural realities. Are we preventing displacement? Are we doing things to hardwire affordability, right? How do we break the curse of the iron law of upgrading, which says in order for a neighborhood to improve, it has to get so expensive that the people who live there can no longer live there? How are we responding to local context, the history, the culture of a place? Mobility, connectivity, accessibility, meaningful community engagement. I'm going to go in depth on community engagement. That's a place that I think is so central to the work. Environmental justice, healthy and safe communities. If you visit, these are one of our closest partners in the Twin Cities. It's called the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability. They have a transformative equitable development toolkit that you can access on their website. And they're really good at talking about how do you focus on racial justice and how do you focus on undoing structural oppression as you're doing the work of community and economic development. They have other great tools around the way in which you value community organizing and community engagement in the process. How do you link sort of the social determinants of health, which is, more and more we understand that actually the food you eat, while it affects you, the air you breathe matters just as much, that the place you live offers you all sorts of health advantages and disadvantages, and that they go together. Issues of environmental sustainability and climate change, and then again, economic opportunities. We also have this toolkit that you can use that is on the Alliance's website as well, which was developed in partnership with community organizations in the Twin Cities, but is replicable to anybody, anywhere, which gives you the opportunity to use an equity scorecard, right? To take your community through an intentional documentation of who benefits from this project and how can you do things to increase more equity in the process. Again, you can find all that stuff on that website. So I wanted to make sure you had a few of those specific tools to go to after this. And again, don't be agnostic. You don't get anywhere with agnosticism. Be active, lean in, and organize. So I want to go deeper into this one principle here in my last 15 minutes. Community engagement is so important to me, right? And I'm going to go over these really quick 5 elements. Moving up the ladder, identifying and develop leaders, shifting from an individualist to a collective paradigm, shifting how we see community, and then the role of bringing diverse groups of people together. Because I think that the challenge for the work of community building, of equitable development, rests in our ability to continue to bring community together and involving them in the shaping of their. You don't want someone to come in your community and tell you what to do, right? We shouldn't do that for other communities either. So there's this ladder of community engagement. I don't know if you've seen this, but some of the aspects of this, right? Too often our efforts are centered on wanting people to participate without giving them opportunity to make real decisions. We stay at the bottom of the ladder, placation, tokenism. We ask them, do you want a dishwasher or an air conditioner? Which is fine, but we didn't ask them any deeper questions around the affordable housing. We say, what do you want your playground to look like, without saying you could have also had a healthcare center, right? Or maybe that's what the community says they want in the real place. So Sherry Arnstein, who has this ladder, talks about there's a critical difference between going through the empty ritual of participation and having the real power to affect the outcomes of a process. So how do we climb that ladder? And how do we make sure that our community engagement is moving up? And be honest, not everything can be citizen control, right? But so be honest and help people understand these are the decisions that are up for deciding, and here are the ones that you have control and power over, and here are the ones you don't, and here's my boss's email, or whatever. So identify and develop leaders. This was my experience in Detroit a little bit. I just felt like I was in a privatized space, and public libraries are, I don't know, they may end up being the last public space that we have, and we have to protect them. And as a public commons, having a unique ability to gather people from within their communities and build power and organize. And when I say organize, I don't mean like agitational, confrontational organizing, although I'm a huge fan of that. But how are we bringing our community together to move from being just being individuals to becoming a constituency willing to work together? I mean, what if libraries, I read that list of some of the like traits of the 21st century library. I mean, what if they were community organizers? I mean, they probably are, right? But trained in community organizing, bringing leaders together, identifying those leaders, investing in their skills, and working with them to act together. So how do we do that work in libraries? Shifting from an individualistic to a collectivist paradigm. So in urban liberal theory, there's this whole way of thinking that's described as the meritocratic paradigm, which says our work is about reducing the barriers for you as an individual to achieve your God-given potential. And it's very focused on the individual, the patron. And while the individual or patron is doing well, the community as a whole is not. And in community development and urban planning, many more people are moving down this path to say, what does having a community paradigm look like? What does collective ownership of land look like? You know, land trusts for housing, real estate investment cooperatives, a really much more of a emphasis on how are we doing together, not just how are you doing as an individual. And so we have to continue to challenge and think about, when is it right to just focus on the individual? I mean, it's great, right? Help an individual person do their resume, get a job. But do we have a role in shaping unemployment in our city or region as a whole? And how do we do that together? Shifting how we see community. And I'll say this really briefly, like Too often in our community engagement, we see the people that we are engaging as beneficiaries of our services rather than actors, powerful actors. And that's a narrative in our brain that we have to shift. And we have to start to see people not as passive recipients, but as powerful people. Not people who we do things for, but who we do things with. Bringing diverse groups of people together. If you don't have this book in your library, it's called The Difference. Scott Page, he's a mathematician at the University of Michigan. It's so good. Mathematician, I don't know, I just love it. I'm an engineer by training, so. But he writes about the 1902 World's Fair. Anybody know what was invented in the 1902 World's Fair? Wait, somebody knew. Ice cream cone. Right? You had the Syrian waffle maker next to the ice cream vendor. The ice cream vendor ran out of bowls. The Syrian waffle maker says, yo, I got waffles. Next thing you know, the waffle cone is born. Okay, so Scott Page writes, he's like, diverse groups of people working together are smarter than brilliant people working alone. Libraries already are good at bringing diverse groups of people together, right? You're not that diverse as a field. I did some research. Somebody tell me how this fits. 2010, 16% of librarians of color. 16%, 9% black, 5% Asian, 2% Asian, or 5% Hispanic, 2% Asian. So there's diversifying in all of our urban planning. Come on, same thing. So bringing diverse groups of people together on purpose. City, county, right? Fields, experiences. How do you do that in really powerful ways? Again, the library as a public commons has a really powerful ability to do that. I got 8 minutes. So the real intent of community transformation, to shift the umbrella under which the traditional problem-solving, investment, and social and community action now take place. It's aimed at the restoration of the experience and vitality of community. We're creating places of belonging where nobody's out and everybody's in. And that is hard work, and we can't just use the same methods we've always used. Things change so fast, and so how are we dynamic in the way in which we do our work, and how are we making sure that community is a part of the process every step of the way? So how many people would agree with this statement? Oh, I have high blood pressure, I just found out. I don't know why I have it, but I think it has to do with the way the world is, and my genes, and I'm high strung. So at Cura, we use the 3 faces of power to do our work. Stephen Lukes is a sociologist, and quick and dirty of the 3 faces of power. Center circle is the decision-making circle. This is like, you got to go to your school board and vote yes or vote no on something. The second circle is the agenda-setting circle. This is who decides what decision is up for deciding in the first place. So we're kind of good at like going to that first circle. Like, I'm going to turn out to the ballot, I'm going to vote no, or I'm going to vote yes. But somebody else decided that was on the ballot. And what's our work of going to shape agendas? Now, agendas are set based on narratives, right? So here's one 5 years ago or so, 4 years ago in Minnesota, voter ID was on the ballot. A group of people had a narrative that said there are too many people who are voting illegally, or that it's too easy to vote if you're not a citizen, or whatever it was. That narrative shaped an agenda that made it a ballot initiative, and then all of us who disagreed had to go to the ballot and vote no. We actually had to vote no twice that year because we also had a marriage equality ballot initiative, another narrative with an agenda and a decision we had to influence. So anyway, we got to do work at all 3 levels. We live in a society in which we are growing increasingly diverse, and yet we remain segregated in communities of sameness. We are hunkering down like turtles with our heads in the shell. And there's so much dynamic change happening, and fear and anxiety become a part of what's happening. So if we're in communities, right, my neighbors in the community that I live in, North Minneapolis, which is facing gentrification pressures, people are like, there's a lot of anxiety. What's going to happen? Am I going to be able to live here when the light rail's finished, et cetera? And fear and anxiety are 2 different things. Now, I'm not a psychologist, so don't take this as science. But fear I describe as like, what you're afraid of. Like, my son is afraid of the dark. I can turn the light on, problem solved. Then he won't sleep, different problem. Anxiety is like, I feel something, I don't know exactly why I feel this way, and then the ability to mediate that anxiety becomes really powerful. And with anxiety, most of the stories we hear today are breaking stories. So if my son wakes up, this is a story John Powell, who's like my fave scholar crush, he tells, you know, this idea of this breaking and bridging of our anxiety. But for me, I think about like, okay, if my third grade son wakes up, he's like first day of school, he's like feeling all sorts of anxiety, and he says, I don't want to go to school, and I don't know why, but I just feel yucky. And I'm like, yeah, dude, you should be anxious because you're not that smart. Kids are mean. Kids are mean, and you're going to get your lunch money stolen, right? He's going to have a hard time going to school. Now, if I say, yo, if I lean in, I get on his level, and I'm like, listen, you're going to learn to read. You're going to make friends and have play dates, and the lunch food is so delish. You know, right? He's going to respond totally differently. We need stories that bridge. And we're looking for leadership to set a narrative that helps us do that. So with all the anxiety that might be happening in a community, what story is the library telling to the folks that are happening? Are they stories that lead us to fear and anger, or empathy and collective solidarity? And I mean, I'm not literally, well, I don't know. Let's slow down. How much time do I have? 4 minutes. Okay. Is it too stupid to be because of like stories, books, libraries? But like to just be like, I really think libraries are really powerfully situated to tell better stories about what's happening in the community. I'm on it. Like we have 3 great libraries in our community. One was renovated about maybe 15 years ago. It was sort of located where we had our largest concentration of public housing, which has now been demolished. But it is the heart and soul of how we understand our history. It has so much history of our community on the north side of Minneapolis. That's on the southern edge of our community. On the northern edge of our community, we just had a brand new library built. It's LEED certified, it's green, it's beautiful. I love it. I go there with my kids, it's windows. And then in the middle of the community, the one closest to me is the North Regional Library. Wait, is there anyone here from Minnesota? Hennepin County? Oh, North Regional Library. And they're going through a process right now to rehab their library. And you know what they're doing? They're hiring an arts-based cultural organization in North Minneapolis to engage community. They're developing principles of equitable development in which they think about how the money gets spent. And they're not doing that just because they decided to do that. I mean, I think there's organizing, and we have a culture right now in the Twin Cities where that is powerful. But the librarians and the leaders at that library are telling really good stories about what's possible and the opportunities that can happen. And so with all of the sort of everywhere I've been in this 45 minutes, the ability for libraries to play a pivotal point in shaping the narrative of what's possible seems really powerful to me.